Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Tom Brassington, a PhD student at Lancaster University researching Gothic Drag, which I'll be introducing in this talk. I'm going to be sort of basically sharing my research practice and how I do things, as well as providing some contextual and theoretical points which I think underscore my research. A quick content warning as well. I will be talking very briefly about transphobic media images in horror cinema. So just be aware that that's going to come up, but it's quite clearly signposted, I think. And yeah, let's just sort of get into it. So sometime during my undergraduate years, a friend introduced me to RuPaul's Drag Race. We illegally streamed episodes of it, binging whatever seasons were available on our preferred television websites. I don't remember what they were though. Through this, I encountered season 4 contestant and winner Sharon Needles and saw a form of drag that I'd never imagined. Here was a spooky drag queen who layered together images from Gothic and horror with drag. She's funny, campy, glamorous, and terrifying. At the time, I did not know that Sharon's style of drag was a marginalized form. I had no queer community to educate me on such subcultural boundaries in my youth, so I did not question her drag's validity. As I've become more familiar with the storytelling methods of reality television and more conscious of the centers and margins of queer artistry, I've come to understand that Gothic drag is at the margins of an already marginalized group. Sharon was by no means meant to win Drag Race according to the sort of formulas of reality show narratives, but to act as a likable underdog character whose preferred style and aesthetic provided a refreshing contrast to the pageantry Drag Race viewers were familiar with. Since RuPaul's Drag Race began airing in 2009, drag performance has exploded into mainstream popular culture. The franchise currently includes 13 television shows, with a season seemingly airing throughout the calendar year. Drag Race UK Season 3 started on Thursday and I'm exhausted. Adjacent to this are shows such as the Boulet Brothers Dragula, which follows Drag Race's established drag reality competition format, but focuses instead on alternative drag styles that are recognizably punk, fantastic, gothic, and grotesque. With this explosion, then, comes a heightened visibility of drag aesthetics that do not neatly conform to a popular cultural stereotype of drag as the practice of a cisgender, effeminate gay male donning makeup, dresses, and shoes to fabricate a stunning illusion. Indeed, from the Drag Race franchise alone, there's an apparent affinity with Gothic aesthetics as seen by runway themes like Death Becomes Her, Beast Couture, Club Kid Couture, Oh My Goth, Weird Science, Monster Mashup, a monster ball consisting of 3 runway looks. So top right is Trampy Trick or Treater, bottom right is Witch Please, and left is Monster I'd Like to Freak Eleganza. And finally, one of my favorite looks, Violet Chachki's Rotten Bug Queen look that she wore to crown the winner of the season following her. So this recurrence and range of dips into Gothic aesthetics, from Trinity K. Bonet's enormous sable feathers through to Sharon Needles' zombie and heels, raises questions about queer affinities for Gothic and horror and the deployment of such aesthetics in queer contexts. My research is concerned with such questions and what the fabrication of Gothic drag does to both components of that phrase. What happens when we put Gothic in drag, and what happens when drag is Gothicized? Drag, I find, offers a highly varied critical toolkit for teasing out certain facets of the Gothic, which in turn produce a fresh queer perspective on the mode. I shall briefly outline what I consider are 2 significant poles of queer Gothic perspectives in a moment, that theoretical underpinning I was talking about at the very start. Throughout this talk, introducing Gothic drag, I'll move through a range of performers and texts to begin considering how Gothic drag manifests. I'll begin with 21st century performers and consider how Gothic impacts drag before performing a drag-inflected close analysis of Matthew Lewis's The Monk. Okay. So before we get into Gothic drag, I think it's first important to situate Gothic drag within established critical and cultural understandings of the term queer Gothic. Drag is, after all, a queer art form, so Gothic drag therefore has some relation to queer Gothic. I think there are two critical and cultural poles that Gothic drag is situated against within queer Gothic, and these are best expressed in an almost archetypal fashion. The positive pole is the horror queer, which is the name of a podcast I listen to, but as a title, I think it works quite well to describe the peculiar popular cultural stereotype of like queer people's fondness for horror genre and the horror genre cinema specifically. So at this positive end, we have sort of two key points of like representation and catharsis, which Sharon Needles in an interview for the BFI describes her love of horror films to me was like the perfect escapism for someone who's like bullied or picked on. A lot of horror films, movies I love are pretty much revenge films, you know. If you look at the Jason Voorhees or the Michael Myers, it's all about returning for revenge. And the archetype of the victims in the 80s horror movies was always the college jock and the popular girl. I think in order, she says this as a joke, I think in order for me not to create another Columbine, I could vicariously live through my high school bullies being slaughtered in cinema. George Haggerty, in a slightly more academic way, says that Gothic fiction offered the one semi-respectable area of literary endeavour in which modes of sexual and social transgression were discursively addressed on a regular basis. So the queer affinity for horror seems largely to be determined by a desire for representation. Gender and sexual variation freely appears in the mode, according to Haggerty, and therefore provides an ample site for queer interpretations. For Sharon Needles, the horror cinema of the 1980s provides a vehicle for catharsis, in which the queer viewer aligns themselves with the monster of the film and sees the fictional counterparts of their real-life abusers slaughtered. Gothic, in its many iterations from the 18th century onwards, provides a fictional form in which queer desires can be represented and some sort of comeuppance is enacted on abusers. Add to this the often spectacular and campy elements of Gothic and horror, both of which are themselves aligned with queerness, and the foundational Gothic texts and films are produced by queers, and we begin to see that Gothic drag itself may be a product of this queer love affair with Gothic and horror. Now, for the negative side. For Gothic drag, the negative correlation of queerness and Gothic is best embodied in the figure of the killer crossdresser. This figure is quite a new addition to the Gothic and horror traditions, seemingly emerging out of Robert Bloch's Psycho and Alfred Hitchcock's subsequent adaptation in 1960. He is followed in cinema by Brian De Palma's 1980 killer in 1980's Dressed to Kill, top right, and then more famously in Thomas Harris's The Silence of the Lambs and its 1991 adaptation, center. Lindsay Ellis has a fantastic video essay exploring the killer crossdresser, so if you want to learn more about this image in the context of transphobia in cinema, I recommend checking that out. But in addition to these classic examples, we have the arguably more sympathetic killer crossdresser, Angela, in 1983's Sleepaway Camp and its sequel, Sleepaway Camp 2, which is, by the way, a lot better. The more literal gender crossings in films like Hammer's 1971, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, and 2020's Freaky. And of course, whatever you want to classify Frankenfurter as in Rocky Horror. Unfortunately, with all that said, Psycho's Norman Bates, Dressed to Kill's Robert Elliot / Bobby, and Silence of the Lambs' Buffalo Bill prevail in popular culture as the killer crossdresser. Each character is notably psychotic in some way, but in a fashion that's kind of murky. Norman has a split personality that seems created from an Oedipal outrage. Robert / Bobby are manifestations of a psychic conflict between so-called male and female aspects of their personality in Dressed to Kill, and Bill is characterized as just a void. The vagueness of their disturbances is unimportant, however, since it can be embodied and characterized through cross-dressing. This is, of course, a transphobic positioning wherein the desire to wear clothes that do not coordinate with your assigned gender is a sign of madness, and a dangerous madness at that. J. Halberstam writes in Skin Shows that in the Gothic, crime is embodied within a specifically deviant form, the monster, that announced itself, demonstrates. I think she's using the pun on the Latin for monster, which is like some sort of announcement, if I remember right, as the place of corruption. Effectively, the killer crossdresser announces its monstrous through its deviant dress, rather than through its murderous acts. Gothic drag, therefore, seems to find itself at an uneasy positioning between these two poles. On the one hand, the drag performer draws on an aesthetic convention which queers have an affinity for. The horror queer pole suggests that Gothic drag is a form of celebration that aligns with Gothic and horror's representation of queerness and its cathartic revenge. On the other hand, in engaging in gender play and using those same aesthetics, the killer crossdresser perennially haunts Gothic drag. So I want to be clear that I don't think either of these poles fully characterizes Gothic drag. Some of the films I've mentioned so far deploy the killer crossdresser image slantwise, and to argue that the image itself is inherently queerphobic, it oversimplifies queer readings of these texts. For instance, if we're to do a phobic reading of Psycho, Dressed to Kill, and Silence of the Lambs, what I find particularly interesting is that transmedicalism specifically pervades those texts. So in each of these films, you have at some point a medical professional authenticating transness and determining exactly how Norman, Robert, and Bill's respective deviations are either proof of trans identity's monstrousness or warrants their respective exclusions from true trans identification. And I think that's a much more sort of nuanced way to think about the transphobia of the killer crossdresser, is how in those films it's medicalized and presented as like this thing that a doctor has to authenticate. They aren't allowed, these murderers aren't allowed to live their true trans lives. Likewise, I think the horror queer identification reduces Gothic drag to its representative capacity, which is both obvious, drag is obviously queer, and suggests that a certain type of individual has authority over who has access to an art form and what it can do, which aligns to notions of propriety and who can and cannot do drag. So I think there has to be a third way that does not tread such familiar ground and reduce Gothic drag to either a recycling of queerphobic imagery or a persistent form of representation. So, I mean, Gothic is a famously ambivalent mode, and so is drag. And in order to sort of tease that out, let's go and look at some Gothic drag. So, in the contemporary drag scene, the most footage of drag performers, and therefore of Gothic drag, is found on television in the reality show format. I mentioned earlier the 13 iterations of Drag Race and its sister show Dragula, so this ought to come as no surprise. The reality show format is often heralded as a somewhat queer-friendly one, if only because it is typically more willing to cast queer contestants. For these reasons, we'll start there. So for reality show Gothic drag, Michael Lovelock's study on reality TV and queer identities proves illustrative. Here he writes that reality TV is thus an intricate and productive cultural form, one which has offered up a diverse range of potential subject positions from which to live out differences to the heterosexual and cisgender norms. At the same time, the formations of queer identity made legible in reality programming are shot through with judgments about their social, ethical, and commercial value, their legitimacy and acceptability. Additionally, he establishes this concept of compulsory authenticity to reality television programming, describing it as the notion that each individual has an innate and essential true self, which it is their duty to discover, manifest, and be faithful to, and that failing to be yourself constitutes nothing short of an existential crisis. And that this has functioned as a profoundly generative force in relation to cultural perception of queer people. Think about how so many reality shows ask its contestants to show the real you and all that sort of stuff. The Gothic drag on screen within the reality television format is therefore one that is bracketed by the television genre and in which it finds itself. Contestants are transformed into archetypal characters: protagonist, antagonist, underdog, narrator, pageant queen, comedy queen, love queen, etc. And their self-presentation must conform to sanctioned notions of authenticity and self-improvement, often proffered by the show's host, in this case RuPaul. So take, for example, Evie Oddly's character arc on Drag Race. I would mark her drag as Gothic for its interest in the body in distress and how she draws on monstrous, decaying, and hybridized images and motifs in her drag. That said, her Gothic drag gets reframed by reality television as a broader alternative drag, marking her as an aesthetic outsider to established drag styles, being pageant and female impersonation. Those are the kind of like hallmarks of a drag queen. It's that stereotype I kind of talked about at the start. Gothic drag in reality television serves to demarcate the drag performer as an underdog, a character who could win, but the odds are against them, rather than as a necessarily credible threat to the crown. They become the character that the audience likes as a person, rather than a frontrunner for victory. So in this, Gothic drag, rather than figuring the performer as monstrous outsider, needing to be ousted, positions the performer in an amicable light. So already we're kind of deviating from that, both that killer cross-dresser and that representation pole by this sort of like friendly monster kind of figure. It's worth noting here as well that Gothic drag, because it's an alternative style, also works as a signal to the audience that this performer is not a credible threat to the crown. And so the Gothic drag performer can only aspire as high as the underdog character. They're kind of always pushed into that character role. With that said, we need to move beyond Drag Race, because if reality show Gothic drag is limited by virtue of the television genre, then looking elsewhere becomes helpful for discerning Gothic drag's qualities. What the reality show tells us is that Gothic drag provides a usable function for fabricating a marginalized but friendly status. Turning to a platform like Instagram elucidates further what Gothic drag looks like and what it does. Immediately apparent is an augmentation of the traits noticeable from television, which are curtailed for financial and production requirements. Online, the performer is self-produced, though there is always constraints. In the case of Instagram algorithms, certain images are more likely to appear in people's feeds, and because drag queens need content that's interactive to make their money, it has to it gets sort of warped to fit that algorithm and work best with it. Likewise, we're more likely to come across drag kings, bio queens, and non-binary performers online, all of which Drag Race has a fraught history with. It tends to prefer cis gay male drag queens. For example, the grotesquerie is often amped up, bodies are often bruised, battered, decaying. Likewise, the boundaries between flesh and costume begin to fall apart. Monstrous experimentation is heightened, and hybrid creatures abound. More homages to a variety of media can be made since copyright is monitored less online. Essentially, there's a greater room for experimentation with Gothic motifs, and Gothic drag performers take that to an extreme. Take, for example, this 9-part series by drag performer Cheddar Gorgeous. Here she uses her drag to explore the colours of the Progress Pride flag and how their respective themes relate to the contemporary climate emergency. Because the original Pride flag was made by hippies in the 70s, each colour has a corresponding meaning. In brief, red is used in the flag to symbolise life, orange healing, yellow sunshine. The Progress flag colours brown and black are for inclusion and diversity. Pink is for visible queerness, green is for nature, blue serenity, purple spirit, and yeah. For each colour bar pink, Cheddar linked it to a corresponding climate and environmental concept. Red's evocation of life allowed her to make a statement on extinction, orange desertification, yellow biodiversity, brown earth, green deforestation, blue ocean environments, purple hope, and black denial. Pink allowed her to explore privileges and notions of passing. So each photo evokes something queer and something environmental using the dragged body. Even passing and visibility have material elements to them, loosely linking them to environmental concerns via consumption. In doing so, Cheddar's photos become evocative of death, destruction, and decay. Black, green, and orange particularly position the body at a site of decay to make their environmental message, and intertwining her body with the environments concerned evokes notions of humans belonging in nature rather than their separateness. I find orange to be the most sort of distressing kind of image in this series because it looks like her skin is cracked, but that's obviously meant to be the point of, you know, the desert's expanding because of human impact on the climate. So it's like the human body and the natural world are just sort of crumbling at the same time. Likewise, blue and yellow hybridize human and animal bodies to produce a sea creature and bug lady. The body in Gothic drag is always in a process of becoming, because drag is an art form of transformation, and the Gothic body is something predisposed to instability. As a body in process, it is therefore not a closed system, and in becoming open, performers are able to align their aesthetic practices with political statements. Gothic drag becomes a political tool in these images of Cheddars. I should also note that Gothic drag here is something hopeful. This is not a Gothic concerned with dreariness, but one that seeks to mobilize. Purple, yellow, and brown speak to that spark of hope, with Cheddar pointing to the closing hole in the ozone layer in purple, the tenacity of nature to remain diverse, and humanity's inevitable collapse back into the earth. Can be kind of positive. I don't know. Gothic drag produces a hopeful and horrifying political Gothic. Moving on to camp. Another example of how Gothic drag amps up both aspects at its intersection is in camp. Camp, a queer form of humour, abounds in the Gothic, from its origins in Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto through to 2016's The Love Witch. Camp is seen throughout the mode, and Gothic drag teases that out further. Susan Sontag argued this in 1964, noting that the origins of camp taste are to be found in 18th century artifacts, with Gothic novels being one of many of Sontag's examples. Subsequent camp criticism further indicates the tremendous tendency of Gothic and horror to be campy. For example, Jack DeBuscio argues that horror cinema's camp qualities emerge from the genre's tendency to make the most of stylish conventions for expressing instant feeling thrills, sharply defined personality, outrageous and unacceptable sentiments, and so on. Likewise, Gothic scholars obliquely suggest the contact point between Gothic and camp, one of which I want to focus on right now is Megan de Bruyne-Mollet's remark in Gothic Remix that camp rehabilitates, suggesting that the campy strand in Gothic drag is one that engages in some kind of healing action, which we can see in Creme Fatale's image here on the left, where she uses the iconography of witchcraft, making specific reference to The Love Witch, great film by the way, to creatively explore her own relationship to love and seeking it. If camp rehabilitates, we can therefore assume that Fatale's camping up of iconography of witchcraft relates love and witchcraft in a means to project some form of healing onto love. Indeed, she writes in the caption to this photograph that it is inspired by my own recent struggles with love and magic. So, in creating a campy image of that struggle, she engages in a renegotiation of her own experiences with love. The photograph on the right of Cheddar, done by Neil Nez Kendall for his Saints and Sinners burlesque exhibition, uses camp differently to Creme Fatale's. Here we have Cheddar costumed as a horned demon in a verdant garden, evocative of an early cinema set. A series of layering is happening in this image. The painterly set design and demon in the garden theme clearly evokes the Garden of Eden. However, this setup is filtered first through an early cinema evocation by the set design. What makes me think that mostly is that tree on the right. It just looks really like it's trying to be a set piece from like a 20s film. It looks like it's trying to look like an early cinema set piece to me. This is then trickily filtered through the contemporary drag contemporary photographers and subjects' perspective, Kendall being a burlesque and vintage performer, and Cheddar being a non-binary drag performer. One of camp's most effective critical tools is its fascination with ephemera past its expiration date. Andrew Ross argues that camp is a rediscovery of history's waste that covets products of a much earlier mode of production, which have lost its power to produce and dominate cultural meanings, and so become available in the present for redefinition according to contemporary codes of taste. Camp's affinity for dated artifacts taps into the resonances of power they once had, redirecting them to new ends. For Ross, this functions as part of a queer strategy for accruing the form of soft power to which queer subjects are often limited, yet this predilection for the resonances of power signified by certain objects remarkably resembles Gothic's own temporal sites. As Robert Miles argues, Gothic's preferred temporality is a period of sensed overlap, where the medieval wanes and the modern begins, which he refers to as the Gothic cusp. On the Gothic cusp, where past meets present, then, must be a myriad historical waste that is refracted through contemporary tastes by audiences and or producers of Gothic work, provoking a camp vision of the Gothic. In its continual layering of historical detritus, Cheddar's camp image draws attention to how Gothic drag is continually engaged with a process of cultural purveying and recycling, allowing us to consider how Gothic's own camp actions can be mobilized as a practice of cultural recycling. Okay. Water. This third image of drag queen Kendall is more Gothicization of camp than something which draws attention to Gothic's own campness. Captioned simply flower power, Kendall is in a horned one-piece covered entirely in flowers. The horns may add a demonic evocation to the costume, loosely Gothicizing it, but I think what happens here is that camp's excessiveness is placed front and center. The quantity of flowers is frankly ridiculous, and her tightly corseted waist provokes a similar sense of excess. There's a kind of queer femme excess going on here, which is a little disturbing to keep looking at. Like, I feel like the longer you look at this image, the more upsetting it kind of becomes, suggesting that there is something unsettling about camp located in its excesses, in what Sontag would call the spirit of extravagance. Finally, it cannot be denied that camp is a comic form, and as presented here by Louisiana Purchase in her photo captioned, "Your fave could never ride Satan," as part of a pink vampire photo series. Purchase prides herself on delivering really good bad drag, which corresponds almost exactly to Sontag's observation that camp taste turns its back on the good-bad axis of ordinary aesthetic judgment. Camp doesn't reverse things, it doesn't argue that good is bad or the bad is good. What it does is to offer for art and life a supplementary set of standards. Purchase, in committing this vampire has sex with Satan pink travesty, offers a comic way of seeing the world. The incongruity of fluffy pink tulle with sexual liaisons with the devil and a hybridized goat man devil at that, in conjunction with a take on the snarky "your faith could never" internet phrase, simultaneously renders all aspects a farce and claims that farce for itself. If queers like Purchase are going to hell, they're going to a hell where they ride Satan in high camp fashion. Gothic drag, then, offers a means of queering the Gothic in a remarkable fashion which mobilizes the Gothic for a range of political and creative explorations. Tapping into Gothic imagery and dragging them up allows performers to consider things from their personal relationship with love to the climate emergency in a highly vibrant manner. What then would dragging the Gothic look like? So for the majority of this paper, I focused on Gothic drag as it is manifested by drag performers, exposing how they creatively drag Gothic aesthetics to a range of ends. For the final portion of this talk, I would like to discuss a reversal of this process, where I take an aspect of drag and apply it to a Gothic text to perform a queer form of close analysis. By doing this, I hope to demonstrate that Gothic drag is not a unidirectional process where performers drag up Gothic aesthetics, but is a multi-directional thing where these performers and me as a scholar are engaging in a critical practice of the Gothic, of dragging the Gothic, title of my thesis. For that, I shall be using the reveal as an aspect of drag performance in relation to Rosario / Matilda in Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which we'll move on to now. So unfortunately, the pictures are over. Reveals are ubiquitous to drag. This is not to say that if a performance does not include a reveal, it is not drag, but rather that reveals feature frequently enough in drag performance to suggest that what reveals do can be deployed for quick analysis. First, though, it's necessary to determine what comprises a reveal. The most obvious aspect of a reveal is that the performer alters their costume in a way that visually removes one thing to expose something new. Importantly, this act is self-inflicted rather than done by others, intimating choice, agency, and power in the action. As reveals are live costume changes, they are therefore also transformative events. The performer's shape changes as their outfit changes. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, reveals are intensely affective. Done well, they're accompanied by cheers, applause, finger snaps, and the likes from the audience, a reaction which in turn energizes the performer. Reveals in Gothic drag, I argue, principally mix affects of unease and eroticism. Rosario / Matilda is perhaps the prototypical Gothic drag creature, a subordinate but crafty spirit of Lucifer's who shapes themselves into two characters. Rosario / Matilda uses drag glamour to capitalize on Ambrosio's incipient perversities. The relationship of Rosario / Matilda's the revelation of Rosario / Matilda's true celestial form at the end of the novel necessarily reframes how their earlier embodiments are understood. Rather than distinct characters, they are costumes worn and removed by the spirit. Instances of undress are therefore part of the performance. Therefore, these are therefore better characterized as the spirit engaging in acts of striptease. They are drag reveals. The spirit's first costume, the guise of Rosario, is an exercise in Eve Sedgwick's argument that veils are suffused with sexuality. The Rosario costume is designed solely for the successful infiltration of the monastery and development of a close relationship between Ambrosio and Rosario. Rosario is introduced as enveloped in a sort of mystery, referring to his mysterious introduction to the Capuchin monastery and peculiar behavior of hiding his face. He seemed fearful of being recognized, and no one had ever seen his face. His head was continually muffled up in his cowl. Veils are suffused with sexuality because they act as a screening garment, which has the concomitant effect of drawing the eye to that which is veiled and raising questions about what lies beneath. Though more often associated with female characters, since veil more commonly appears as a descriptor of a feminine screening garment, a monk's cowl, and certainly Rosario's, functions similarly. It is a screening garment which covers, and so can elicit a similar erotic charge to its feminine counterpart. Indeed, Rosario's cowl raises exactly those curiosities in Ambrosio, who could not help sometimes indulging a desire secretly to see the face of his pupil. Given this queer erotic coding, Rosario's revelation that he is Matilda becomes interpretable as striptease. It is also worth noting that the monk has been convincingly read as deploying tropes common to 18th century gay porn by Clara Tweet in an article for Romanticism on the net. It's a very fun read, would recommend. Next time you encounter the novel, read it in the voice of stilted porno acting and you might sort of see these things. At this avenue, aware-ish becomes a useful concept for understanding later acts of undress. Aware-ish derives from camp and burlesque studies to refer to a subject's knowledge of their sexuality and their ability to use that and perform that sexuality. In her study on 19th century fin de siècle burlesque and pinups, Maria Elena Buschek argues that aware-ishness is apparent in the presentation of the multiplicitous, shifting, even unstable womanhood of the actress, whose ordinarily taboo expression of the female sexual agency and self-awareness many contemporary feminists were promoting, was viewed as acceptable under the rubric of burlesque theatricals. For Buschek, this produces a subversive, expressive sexuality that period feminists would increasingly view as an essential part of modern women's emancipation. Awarishness, then, engages a process by which the performer achieves agency through their expressions of sexuality. Positioning Rosario / Matilda as an aware subject begins by factoring in how the spirit is tasked with coercing Ambrosio to sign away his soul to Lucifer, achieving this by appealing to Ambrosio's nascent sexual desires. Striptease can be read into the scene where Matilda plays the harp for Ambrosio, which I've mostly copied above. Matilda begins with a soft and plaintive air before she then plays with an hand bold and rapid. She struck a few loud martial chords and then chanted the following ballad to an air at once simple and melodious. The ballad's not important because this is striptease. Matilda appears so enraptured in her performance that the following happens. The attitude in which she bent over her harp was easy and graceful. Her cowl had fallen backwarder than usual, 2 coral lips were visible, ripe, fresh, and melting, and a chin in whose dimples seemed to lurk 1,000 cupids. Her habit's long sleeve would have swept along the cords of the instrument. To prevent this inconvenience, she had drawn it above her elbow, and by this means an arm was rediscovered, formed in the most perfect symmetry, the delicacy of whose skin might have contended with snow in whiteness. Ambrosio dares to look on her but once. That glance sufficed to convince him how dangerous was the presence of this seducing object. Again, these exposures are not an accident of Matilda being swept up in her harp playing, but are the awarish actions of a crafty spirit designed to incite desire. Her cowl falls not only because she is invested in her harp playing, but because her performance is meant to stir Ambrosio's own vices and desires. Her cowl already incites curiosity in Ambrosio. Coupled with its erotic potential as a Gothic screening garment, its falling back to reveal Matilda's face is akin to the big reveal in a burlesque and drag performance, where the performer exposes her chest. Her raised sleeve similarly becomes an act of anathema or skirt raising. Now, Barbara Brownie writes in Acts of Undressing that one thing that unites all acts of undressing is that as uncommon spectacle they demand to be observed, which maps directly onto how captivated Ambrosio is by Matilda's now exposed face and arm. As Rosario, the spirit elaborately crafts the stage in which Matilda's strip occurs by being a deliberately obscure and covered figure. Matilda capitalizes on this raised tension by engaging in 2 elaborate strip teases, equally charged with different emotions. There's one that happens a little bit earlier where like one boob falls out and it's just like Ambrosio's just like, oh my God, I can't. He just like absolutely loses his mind over like a single exposed breast, which is presented as an accident of the melodrama caused by Ambrosio's rejection. And the cowl reveal is wrapped neatly with notions of compassion and enrapture in her art. Matilda is wrapped in her art, but the spirit's art is striptease performance rather than harp playing. This is particularly apparent when considering another of Brownie's observations about acts of undressing. An abandoned garment can be read as a predictor of its owner's future actions. Across performances, shed clothes signal a shift in the performance. Drag reveals beget new costumes or fun moments of effective intensity, as do burlesque reveals and strips. Here, the spirit's discarding of the cowl reveals a future intention through the release of the sexualized veil's eroticism. By the end of the chapter, Ambrosio has taken Matilda as a sexual partner and forgot his vows, his sanctity, and his fame. He remembered nothing but the pleasure and opportunity. Let's just not forget that this is because of one exposed boob, some nice lips, and a pretty arm. However, it bears repeating at this point that this is the spirit's goal. So their fabrication of mystery and eroticism through methods which seem to render them into the object of Ambrosio's lusty male gaze is intentional. The spirit, as Rosario and Matilda, puts on this show Ambrosio is as much an object of their performance as Matilda is an object of Ambrosio's gaze. The gaze is artfully manipulated in striptease by the stripper, with agency emerging from that manipulation. As Claire Nally writes in her article on neo-burlesque, there is a collapse of the strict lines between performer and audience, and therefore we must speculate how the gaze is a hostile heterosexual one, or rather whether there is a sense of celebration, internal interrogation, and identification. Nally is, of course, discussing the audience-performer relations in the entirely different context of 21st century neo-burlesque performance, where audiences more consciously feel like active participants in the show. However, her observation about questioning the gaze's hostility can be applied to the monk when we consider that, like these performances, Ambrosio and Matilda wear monastic habits. They are arguably in a similar situation where sartorial similarity facilitates a blurring of the boundaries between audience and performer, and therefore subject and object. Likewise, as the monk shares its tropes and motifs so heavily with 18th century gay pornography, as Tuit argues, the context in which we find these reveals in the monk is more comparable to burlesque's own complicated subject-object relations than it at first appears. In Rosario, Matilda, Spirit's Gothic reveals, we find a prototypically burlesque relationship to subject-object relations and the pleasures and desires on which they act. Jackie Wilson likens burlesque to a halfway house between erotica and pornography, between morality and immorality, glamorous veiling and seductive unveiling, teasing and containment, a midpoint which plays and fuses our fears and anxieties and desires. This fusion is highly reminiscent of Gothic's own production of pleasurable fear, and the mode's fascination with the removal of screening garments and that action's consequent reveal presents one way of producing that pleasurable fear. A side effect of this creation of pleasurable fear via striptease is the blurring of subject-object relations and interrogation of the gaze's hostility and the complicity or coercion of the stripping subject/object. And that is basically how I use drag to read the Gothic. So, thank you.